Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michael Quinn Sullivan of Empower Texans. Really appreciate you taking time this afternoon to join us with this live conversation with United States Senator Ted Cruz. Hope that you will click like and share on the video. Let your friends and family join into the conversation today. You can also, Facebook now lets you invite people specifically. So if there's that specific friend from high school, from college, a family member who you know specifically should be involved in the conversation, you can invite them here onto the chat. We'll also, of course, be archiving this not only on Facebook, but our website and our YouTube channel, so you can watch it again later, that sort of thing. But again, remember to click like and offer your questions and comments throughout our time together. But right now I want to go up to Washington, D.C., where United States Senator Ted Cruz is joining us from his office. Senator Cruz, thank you so much for being with us today. Senator Cruz, I want to kind of kick off. A lot of folks are frustrated with what they see coming out of Washington, D.C., where for it seems like 8-9 years we had people telling us that if you only elect a Republican Senate, Republican House, Republican White House, everything will be done. And so far, things are done. As someone who ran on that, how do you explain the lack of forward momentum so far, and what can we maybe be hopeful for here in the months ahead?
Well, Michael, it's great to join you. Thank you for all the good work you do each and every day fighting for free market principles and limited government, the Constitution, in the state of Texas. Look, I understand that frustration fully well. And we've got an historic opportunity. We've got an opportunity that doesn't come along very often, where the voters have given Republicans control of the White House, of every federal agency, and majorities in both houses of the Congress. And we got to deliver now. It is time for real results. In my view, there are 4 big priorities for Congress and the new administration. Number 1, honoring our promise to finally repeal the disaster that is Obamacare. Number 2, major tax reform and a big tax cut. Number 3, fundamental regulatory reform, lifting the burdens of Washington on farmers, on ranchers, and small businesses. And number 4, nominating and confirming strong constitutionalists to the federal courts and the U.S. Supreme Court. If we deliver on those 4, this could be the most productive Congress in decades. It would have an enormous impact for our country. And if we fail to deliver, if we come up short on those 4, this would be a heartbreaking missed opportunity. Right now, standing here, I don't know which one it's going to be. I can tell you what I'm spending every waking moment, day and night, doing is working, trying to bring Republicans together to deliver on those 4 commitments, and with a very simple message: let's do what we promised the voters we would do. Let's actually just do what we said we would do.
So you mentioned tax reform. I want to start there, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
You gave a great speech at the Tax Foundation on September 13th. I want to read a quote from you, which I know is always awkward to have people read quotes to you. But you said, "The first objective of tax reform is growth. Economic growth should be number 1. Growth, growth, growth." Do you believe that our current tax system, as it stands today, is the thing that is standing in the way of growth? I mean, that's what you seem to imply here.
Well, it is certainly a major impediment to growth. If you look historically, every time the federal government has pursued policies of high taxes, a crushing tax code, high regulations, high spending, high debt, the result, predictably, over and over and over again, is economic stagnation, is relatively few jobs, is wages stuck and not going up. On the other hand, if you look historically, every time the federal government has pursued a policy of cutting taxes, simplifying the tax code, reducing the regulatory burden on small businesses, the result has been incredible economic growth. We saw that in the 1920s with Coolidge. We saw that in the 1960s with JFK, and we saw that in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan. Cutting taxes works. And what I hope is that we see the president, the administration, and our majorities in Congress focus, as you just read, on economic growth, on simplifying the tax code, on reducing tax rates, particularly on small businesses and job creators, because the result of that will predictably be millions of new high-paying jobs and wages rising for everybody.
In Collin County, we have Sabrina Kimberly watching, who says, "Thank you, Senator Cruz, for taking care of Texas. We love you in Collin County." So Sabrina Kimberly, appreciate your comment. I know Senator Cruz does as well. Senator, you, in that speech to the Tax Foundation, you laid out the need to simplify the tax code, something you just referenced here. And the way I've heard you talk about it, the way I've heard actually our friend Pete Sessions talk about it and Donald Trump talk about it, folks will be able to send in their taxes on a postcard-sized return. Explain why that's important to you.
Well, look, I liked your suggestion of a Post-it. That may be even better. We're headed the right direction. Look, one of the major principles that I think should govern tax reform is simplicity. Simplifying the code. We right now have 7 different rate structures. I'd like to see it drop down to one simple flat tax. You'll recall what I proposed during the presidential campaign was a simple flat tax that was fair and uniform for everybody. What I think is critical as a part of that is that you simplify it. We spend billions of hours every year with tax compliance, dealing with lawyers and accountants and trying to figure out the paperwork and filling out IRS paperwork and forms and everything else. All of that is wasted. None of that produces anything. We don't produce a truck. We don't produce a tortilla. We don't produce nothing except busy work from the government. And so my hope is that in passing tax reform, we give every American the ability to fill out their taxes on a postcard. And I'll tell you, Michael, the biggest plus of a postcard is actually the physical dimensions of it. That it means a subsequent Congress can't go add a bunch of complexity to the code because there's no space. I mean, they might try to put 4-point font. But it's
how small can you write is going to be the question.
So I think simplicity when it comes to taxes is incredibly powerful. It's something that resonates with the people, and it's something that has powerful economic effects at the same time.
So one element of this has been the issue of repatriation of American dollars. You mentioned that in your Tax Foundation speech. Give folks a sense of what that would mean for the economy to bring those dollars back into the United States.
Well, the United States has the highest corporate tax rates of any developed country in the world. And we have a system of double taxation that if U.S. corporations bring money from overseas back to America, they get hit with punitive taxes. They get hit with the highest taxes in the world. The result is U.S. companies have overseas over $2 trillion in capital, nearly $3 trillion. Of money that's overseas. I think one of the things that's very important in tax reform is that we change to what's called a territorial system, which will enable them to bring back that money to the United States, and $2 to $3 trillion invested in new factories, invested in new jobs, new equipment, new investments here in the United States that's focused very directly on jobs and growth. That is going right at the heart of what tax reform should be all about.
When we talk about repatriation of money, obviously we're talking about corporate dollars. We'll go back to something that affects a lot of families very personally. And it's not just the super rich who deal with this. That's the death tax,
sure.
An onerous burden. What do you think the chances are of this Congress attacking the death tax once and for all?
I'm actually quite optimistic on that, Michael. And it's one of the principles that I laid out last week at the Tax Foundation, that we need to end the death tax. The death tax is fundamentally unfair. It's people who pay taxes their whole lives. You pay taxes as you earn the money. And what the federal government does is after you pay taxes once, when you have apparently the ill manners to die, they tax you again for being so rude as to pass away. That's not right. It's not fair. And what it does is it in particular hammers small businesses and farmers and ranchers. Because if you have the family farm, maybe your grandfather farmed on it and you farmed on it, and you want to pass it on to your kids and grandkids, over and over again, farmers or ranchers or small businesses have to sell all or part of the farm or ranch or business just to pay Uncle Sam, taxing them again because of death. It's not fair, it's not right, and it breaks up too many family farms and small businesses. My hope is we eliminate it altogether. It's what I'm pressing for us to do.
So we'll switch gears and talk about Obamacare. Donald asks, maybe the simplest way to put this, what's going to happen to my health care? We see a lot of folks asking that question. Congress, many members of Congress campaigned, passed resolution after resolution. The Texas Senate has passed resolutions calling for the abolition of Obamacare. And we saw that kind of collapse in a spectacularly ignoble fashion this summer and the spring. Where do we go next with Obamacare?
Well, look, it was frustrating. It was maddening when at 2 in the morning on the Senate floor, I was standing on the Senate floor, we saw Obamacare repeal be voted down by a single vote.
Right.
After 7 years, Republicans have campaigned for 7 years promising if you elect us, we'll repeal Obamacare. I think failure is not an option. I think we cannot accept failure. We've got to deliver on that promise. And so early on, the beginning of this year, I assembled a group of 6 senators across the ideological spectrum, all Republicans, but conservatives, moderates from different states, from Medicaid expansion states, non-expansion states. That became the Obamacare repeal working group that began meeting once a week and then twice a week, trying to come together. I think we're almost there. We're not there yet, but there is another very hard push for a vote next week to repeal Obamacare. And the key thing we got to do is we've got to get to 50 votes. We have 52 Republicans. We came 1 vote short the last time, and a whole lot of us are working to get people together. I think the way we do it, the way we get to 50 votes and get the job done, is we focus like a laser on lowering premiums.
Right.
Biggest reason people hate Obamacare, are hurting under Obamacare, is it's made premiums skyrocket. The average family's premiums have increased over $5,000 a year under Obamacare. And I hear that from Texans all over the state. I can't afford health insurance for my family. The way we lower premiums is through more competition, more options, more choice, more consumer freedom. And so that's what I'm pressing for, is lifting the federal regulations that restrict your choices, giving you more options, which will drive down prices and make it easier for you and your family to afford the health insurance you need.
All right, watching us right now from Spain is Jonathan Romaine, who says, encouraged by Senator Cruz's desire to take the government off our back. And that kind of harkens both, we've talked about taxes, talked about Obamacare. So much of what you and a good number of your colleagues have been focused on is that problem of so much government sitting on our back. You mentioned the need for regulatory reform. That might be one, in my mind, the kind of the unsung successes so far this year have been the sheer number of regulatory burdens that have been eased under the Trump administration and with the approval of Congress.
Well, reg reform is one of the areas perhaps I'm most optimistic about the new administration. Virtually every single cabinet member I've sat down with, among the very first words out of their mouth have been reg reform. And the commitment seems real and genuine. And my view on regulatory reform is we should pursue it through 3 parallel avenues. Number 1, executive action, which is swift, but it's also temporary. The next president can undo it like that, as Obama is discovering.
Right.
The second avenue is regulatory through formal notice and comment. That's slower, but it is more permanent. It is harder for the next administration to undo it. Mm-hmm. And then the final is statutory. Congress passing a new law, the president signing it. That is by far the slowest process, but it's the most permanent. And I think there are a couple of good opportunities for statutory reg reform. One is tax reform. I'm pushing very hard to include Dodd-Frank repeal while we do tax reform. Tax reform is going to be done on what's called reconciliation, which means the Democrats can't filibuster it. We can pass it just with 50 votes. And Dodd-Frank has hammered community banks and small credit unions, small financial institutions. All of the institutions that lend money to small businesses have been devastated by Dodd-Frank. And so I think we have an opportunity while doing tax reform to take out the really harmful effects of Dodd-Frank. The second really good opportunity for legislative reg reform, I think, is on infrastructure. Next year, I think it's likely we will see a major infrastructure bill coming through Congress. I think Republicans and Democrats both want to see an infrastructure bill. The president certainly does. And the argument I'm making is, listen, it doesn't make any sense to spend billions of dollars on roads and bridges if you can't get a dang permit to build the road or bridge. And speeding that up will be a big deal. And I think there may be an opportunity on infrastructure to do some really long-lasting reg reform there as well. And that's what I'm pressing to do.
Last night, the United States Senate voted on the National Defense Reauthorization Act. You were successful, I noted, in putting several amendments onto the NDAA that were quite beneficial to Texans. Among those that stood out for me were the DoD site clearinghouse to address wind farm interference. Now that's probably half the folks watching eyes just glazed over when I read those 5 words, but it has a pretty significant impact for folks.
Well, that's right. We have a number of bases that do air training, and the problem is it's very hard to train our pilots when there are hazards of large windmills that are being erected in their flight paths. And we want Texas to continue to be the premier destination for our military, for military bases, and for training. And if you have wind farms making the bases less attractive as an area to train, that's not good for the state of Texas. And so that amendment we did working in consultation and close cooperation with our bases to make sure that we maintain the strong national leadership position Texas has with our bases. Let me note also in the NDAA, there are a lot of very positive amendments that I worked hard to get included and got bipartisan support for. But by far the biggest deal in the NDAA is the top line numbers. If you look at the really harmful consequences of the Obama presidency, few areas were more devastated than the military, where our readiness has been dramatically undermined. This NDAA raises the authorization for defense spending to nearly $700 billion. That's an increase of over $100 billion. That is a big deal in terms of making sure we're providing the training, the equipment, we are recruiting the soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines. We need to keep this country safe in what is becoming a much more dangerous world.
The other item that I noted in the NDAA was the religious liberty training for senior leaders. Why was that an important issue for you?
Well, religious liberty has been, as you know, a passion of mine my whole life. And it's an area that I've spent a lot of time fighting for the state of Texas, both when I was Solicitor General of Texas, defending religious liberty in the state, and also in the Senate. And I'll tell you, the military, particularly under President Obama, has had a less than great history on religious liberty. I'm reminded of there was an Air Force chaplain in Alaska who wrote a blog post referencing there are no atheists in foxholes.
Right.
And that chaplain was reprimanded by his superiors for saying that. Now, look, I think that's ridiculous. We need to have a military that respects the religious liberty of our servicemen and women, that they are fighting to protect our rights, and we shouldn't be stripping away their own rights in the process. And so every year on the Senate Armed Services Committee, I've worked with other senators, especially Mike Lee. Mike and I have teamed up on this issue to push for protecting the religious liberty of chaplains and of servicemen and women to defend our nation and also be able to worship God without getting in trouble.
Senator Cruz, I want to shift gears. We've kind of gone from big picture down into the state. Nothing has been more deeply impactful to Texans than Hurricane Harvey's landfall. And I know it affects your family as a Houstonian. Walk us through what you see happening here in the coming weeks and months for the rebuilding from the federal government. Obviously, we saw the vote for the aid package, but what else can Texans expect to see coming out of Washington, D.C. with Harvey relief?
Well, the impact from Hurricane Harvey has been devastating. And I've spent much of the past month traveling over and over and over again to all of the affected regions. I mean, when Harvey made landfall, it made landfall in South Texas, and it just hammered Victoria and Rockport and Port Aransas and Aransas Pass, and then it moved north. And the damage down in those cities was primarily wind damage, because you had about 130 mile an hour winds. So I remember in Refugio, which I was down there about a week ago, I saw, for example, a small plane that had been ripped out of a hangar, tossed a quarter mile, and slammed nose down into the ground, and it was leaning with its tail against another building. The wind damage is massive in that part of the state. But then the storm moved north and parked over the city of Houston and just sat there for 4 days. Now, I'm a Houstonian. I lived there. I was home during the storm. In 4 days, we got 51 inches of rain in 4 days. That's as much rain as Houston gets in a year was dumped on the city in 4 days. And we saw flooding just about everywhere. We saw flooding. Neighborhoods all around Houston were really badly hit. Meyerland and Kingwood and Bel Air and a lot of northwest by Addicks and Barker reservoirs were horribly flooded. I mean, I remember going on an airboat just north of Addicks and Barker through neighborhoods where water was up to the roofs of those houses. And these are houses that are not in a floodplain. These are not houses that have ever flooded, but this was a 1,000-year storm.
Right.
And then after that, it kept moving east, and it slammed Beaumont and Port Arthur and Nederland and Orange. And you know, just a couple days ago on Friday, I was in Port Arthur and Rockport and Meyerland, and the damage there was massive, a lot of flooding again. What is hard to really grasp unless you go and survey all of this is the incredible geographic breadth of this damage. That typically you have a disaster, it hits an area and the community has to come together and rebuild. This is 250 miles of devastation. This runs from Corpus Christi to Louisiana. And it is massive. It is predicted to be the costliest natural disaster in U.S. history, and I believe it just based on having seen the massive numbers of homes and businesses that have been damaged or destroyed. Now, during the hurricane, we saw amazing heroism. We saw first responders. We saw ordinary Texans risking their lives to save their neighbors, as I've called them, rednecks in bass boats. You know, that's the face of Texas. That's who we are, and the country saw the courage and unity and sacrifice and love that characterizes our great state as we came together in the crisis. And I will tell you that in the weeks that followed, each of these communities have been helping their neighbors, helping rebuild, helping those whose homes were destroyed. We're going to come through this. As you noted, Congress just passed a major relief package. When it came out of the House of Representatives, it was a little over $7 billion. I joined with my colleague John Cornyn in the Senate in doubling the amount of relief that was available to Texas. We took it from $7 billion up to over $15 billion. That's what Congress passed. Now, that is intended to be an initial down payment. Everyone understands that the cost of this storm is going to be much higher than that. But that was designed to get dollars on the ground immediately, dollars for FEMA to help people rebuild, dollars for the SBA to help businesses get back on the ground. We're going to take a lot of work, and we've got bipartisan commitments from Washington and from the president that whatever Texas needs to come through this storm, we're going to get.
Speaking in Port Arthur a week or so ago, you said, in the face of that disaster, we also have seen incredible bravery, incredible heroism of neighbors rescuing neighbors and friends rescuing friends. And it feels like, as a Texan, obviously, we have our own peculiar sense of pride. But that is I guess the story that's going to come out of Harvey that maybe affects me more than else is the sheer number of hours and energy that, beyond the first responders, beyond the Coast Guard and the National Guard, just that real live human beings volunteering their time have put far more into this so far than we have seen in almost any other disaster, and certainly more than we will see government do.
So let me tell a couple of specific examples of that. In Houston, in Harris County, they put out a call, if you've got a flat-bottom boat and you can help, we need your help. In the Harris County Emergency Operations Center, there was an entire wall covered with Post-its of people who called in and said, hey, I got a boat, and had their name and where they were in their cell phone. And the Harris County Emergency Center operated basically as a dispatch where they'd get a call, a 911 call, and they'd call you up and they'd say, okay, Michael, your neighbor 6 blocks over needs help. Can you go get them? And there were thousands of people doing that.
Wow.
Let me give you another story post-hurricane of that. When I was in Rockport on Friday, one of the places that I went to visit was a parking lot that had been feeding first responders and feeding people who had lost their homes. And it was very interesting. I met a pastor and his wife who are actually from Harlingen. They're from down in the valley. And they wanted to help. The valley did not get hit hard by the storm. And so they drove up to Rockport and began feeding people. They went out with their church and they bought several big barbecues and began cooking meals three days a week, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They'd have volunteers. The pastor said every day volunteers for the church were driving 3 hours from Harlingen up to Rockport, cooking meals all day, and then driving 3 hours back home, and then turning around and coming the next day. And in the course of a couple of weeks, they had served over 42,000 meals.
Wow.
I mean, that's justice. That is who our great state is.
Senator, I know you are on a very tight schedule. I've got one last question. This is from Rachel, who on Facebook asks, you mentioned Obamacare, although I will add, I think this could apply to a lot of issues, failing to be voted down by only one vote. How can we, as average citizens, best help change that outcome next time? How can we, who have no official government position, effectively influence government? How would you, as a sitting senator, recommend that folks watching best affect, whether it's the Obamacare vote next week or tax reform? What do you recommend citizens doing?
Well, look, it's a great question, and it's what we're doing right now. It is be engaged, be informed, and speak out, and hold elected officials accountable. One of the great things about the internet and social media and technology is it's given tools for people back home to actually know what's going on. You do a fabulous job of helping people know what's going on in Austin, and people know what's going on in Washington. The old, it used to be that the way politics was done is you go home, you stand in a soapbox, you tell the voters what they want to hear, and then you go to Washington and you cut the deals with the lobbyists and it's business as usual. And you count on those two worlds never finding out what the other is being told. We're now in a totally different world where the grassroots are engaged, involved, informed, and active. And so I would encourage you, keep doing that. Keep following the issues, studying, learning, and speaking out, engaging. When Heidi and I were running the presidential, the most amazing thing of the whole campaign was that we had 326,000 volunteers nationwide, people knocking on doors and making phone calls and sending emails. That is powerful. And you have a powerful voice, and what I would encourage you, hold your elected officials accountable. Hold me accountable. Hold everybody else accountable. And the simplest message, I think, the best message, is do what you said you would do. If you spent 7 years campaigning on repealing Obamacare, how about you go up there and actually repeal Obamacare? How about you actually cut taxes, actually reduce regulations, bring jobs back to Texas? That's the best thing we can do, is hold our elected officials accountable by using your voice and shining a light.
You know, Senator Cruz, I think that you've perhaps ended our time together on the best possible note. I can say, from my perspective, having watched you as our Solicitor General, having watched you now in the United States Senate, you have done exactly what you said you would do. I know all of us at Empower Texans, and a lot of the folks watching share that sentiment. So thank you so much for your time. Hope you have a fantastic day, and hope you get to leave D.C. soon and come home quick.
I'm looking forward to coming home very, very soon. Thank you, and God bless you.